lost in your smile. Even though I'm a free thing, tied up tight to your love, caught up in another spell. Even though I'm still trying, wow, you don't know how far I'm gone. Fell right from the wishing well. There's only half of me here, half of me lost, lost in your sweet smile. Even though I've been thinking, even though trying to say right, half of me still in your world. Even though I've been lonely, even though wanna be whole, always half is in your world. The whole problem is that half of me here, half is lost in your smile.
Welcome everyone. Welcome to Chelsea College of Arts. My name is Jane McFadden. I'm Head of College of Camberwell, Chelsea and Wimbledon Colleges and Pro Vice Chancellor of the University. One of four PVCs from each of the colleges. So welcome to our college. It's fantastic to see everybody else here tonight and to come to this exciting talk by our visiting scholar, writer and curator, Moacir dos Anjos. I've been trying to make sure I do that right, but you know, I've had some lessons. Thank you. So Moacir is our artist in residence, our scholar in residence for about 3 weeks. Arrived on Saturday, so just getting the lie of the land, and we're really delighted that he's here with us, and really looking forward to hearing from him tonight, but also seeing the impact he will have on the students that he's going to be working with in fine art and our PhD students. So that's a really brilliant opportunity for them to hear directly from such an informed scholar and to work with him. I'm not going to talk too much about Moacir himself because I know that my colleague Paul will be introducing him more thoroughly. But I think the most important thing is to say it's a really important time for us to have this kind of level of knowledge brought to us as a university, and to hear about the work that's happening in other parts of the world around this, the agendas around diversification, but also about the kind of impact of the history and legacy that sits within the colonial legacy, and hearing about that in a more global context, because I think at the moment it's important that we hear from people beyond our shores. So we hope that this will be the start of a relationship that continues, and that the work that we do with Moacir will see us expanding into different ways of working with people in Brazil and beyond, but it's certainly a very good starting point for that. In terms of broadening our knowledge, it really is key to our work that we invite people in to bring their understanding to us. This work has come to us tonight because of lots of hard work and brilliant thinking from the support of our international development team, but most importantly from our Research Centre for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation, TRAIN, and the work of our colleagues here who have seen where we need to gather new knowledge from. So thank you to all of those colleagues that have made this happen. So I'm going to pass over now to Paul Goodwin, who's going to do a proper introduction to the work of our visiting scholar. And I say thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, Jane. So my name is Paul Goodwin. I am Professor of Contemporary Art and Urbanism here at Chelsea at UAL, and also Director of the Research Centre for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation, which is one of the UAL-wide research centres that since around 2004 has been one of the leading voices in advocating for and critiquing the politics of the transnational and the global in the contemporary art and design fields. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker tonight, Moacir dos Anjos, who is a scholar and curator based in Recife, and please forgive my emasculation of Brazilian Portuguese terms, but I'll try my best. I've been practicing. Is a scholar and curator based in Recife, the capital of the northeastern state of Pernambuco. He's a researcher at the Fundação Joaquim Nabuco, where he recently assumed the directorship of the Foundation's Anthropology Museum, the Museum of the Northeastern Man. Wonderful title, which Moacir describes as a museum that carries in its name an ambition and an equivocation. Moacir is no stranger, of course, to UAL, where between 2008 and 2009, he was indeed a visiting fellow with us at TRAIN, invited, of course, by Dr. Michael Asbury, who's the Deputy Director of TRAIN, and who also is joining us online this evening, and is very much part of the organisation of this event. In rapid succession, he was invited to curate the 2010 Sao Paulo Biennale, along the themes of politics and poetry, and for which he gathered a truly transnational team of collaborating curators, including, this is a real star, now I remember this biennial very well, Sarah Maharaj, Analdo Farias, Rina Carvajal, Fernando Alvim, Yuko Hasegawa, and Chus Martinez, a real star lineup. That Sao Paulo biennial proved indeed to be one of the 21st century's most ambitious and extensive editions. In quick succession to Sao Paulo, Moacir was the curator of the Brazilian Pavilion at the 54th Venice Biennale in 2011. Now, Moacir's curatorial work is too numerous to list here. There's many exhibitions that he's done. His most recent exhibitions, which have a strong relation to the talk today, and I believe that he will be speaking about these exhibitions, were Necro Brasiliana at the Fundação Joaquim Nabuco, and Paranense Museum, and at the Fundação Joaquim Nabuco and Paranense Museum, and the Negros nas Piscina at the Pinoteca of the state of Ceará, both in 2022. Moacir has also written countless articles on contemporary art and is the author of numerous books, including Local Global, Art in Transit in 2005, Artebra Critica in 2010, and Contraditorio, Art, Globalization and Belonging in 2017. And the title, as you can see, of the lecture tonight is The Plantation, the Pool, Decolonial Strategies in Brazilian Contemporary Art. What we're going to do is, after this introduction, I'm going to invite Moacir to take the stand to give his lecture for about 30, 35 minutes, 40 minutes. And then we will take to these wonderfully comfortable chairs and have a conversation and invite you into the conversation through questions. And I believe there will also be questions online that we'll also try to feed into the conversation. So please, Moacir.
Good evening. First, thank you for the invitation, for the welcome, and for the introduction, the generous introduction by Paul. And it's a pleasure to be here again after a few years that I've been a visiting scholar here at UL. And, well, the title of my presentation, Plantation, the Pool, the Colonial Strategies in Brazilian Contemporary Art, refers to a recent and noticeable change in the field of arts in Brazil. The emergence in the last 10 years or so of an openly political artistic production. And what do I mean by when I call this recent production as political? First of all, it's a production that differs in an upfront way from the art that has been hegemonically associated to Brazil in the last 2 or 3 decades. An art that has been celebrated inside and outside Brazil for its originality and for its conceptual and formal sophistication, but which has almost always ignored, with some few exceptions, the violence that marks Brazil. The violence that historically almost defines Brazil. And that pays no attention to the resistance to this violence as well. But say that this new production, that this recent production is political, is not enough to characterize it, as it also differs from the political art made in Brazil during the military dictatorship that ruled the country between mid-60s to mid-80s. For this current generation of artists, it's no longer the case of dealing with violence imposed by a state of exception, but to recognize that Brazil has always been and still is even under a democratic regime, a violent country to live in. Maybe not for everyone, but for large parts of its population. And what this new artistic production has been doing is precisely to deal with this formative violence, a violence that is evident as it has been denied, or at least ignored, even in the field of arts. Indeed, Brazil is a country founded or invented by violence, by acts of extreme violence. It's a country established by colonial violence. Brazil bears inscribed in its origins marks of the slavery and extermination of the native population who lived there, who lived in the lands invaded by European colonizers at the beginning of the 16th century. It's a country that also exhibits marks of the equally extreme violence of a white European minority against the approximately 5 million black men and women removed by force from different parts of Africa and brought to be enslaved in that new world that was being formed there. A violence that over several centuries has been reproduced, transformed, and for some becomes something natural, something inevitable. A violence that reaches the descendants of those who first suffered the consequences of the invention of Brazil. It's a country that is anchored, therefore, in racism, because racism is the only way to justify the dehumanization of the dead and of the subjugated in the process of building Brazil. Racism, in fact, is perhaps one of the things that best define Brazil as a nation. Racism is a crucial element of what can be called Brazil's national identity. And racism has produced countless inequalities. It can be said that racism produced an unequal distribution of the possibilities that white and non-white bodies will have to live with autonomy, or, on the contrary, to be subordinated to someone else. Inequalities that cross space of work, housing, and leisure. Inequalities anchored to the ethnic origin or to the skin color of each inhabitant of the country. This violence and its consequences began to be recorded as images already in the 16th century, shortly after the arrival of the European colonizers. Images like the ones I'm showing here, created by the so-called traveling artists. European artists brought to Brazil between the 16th and the 19th centuries with the official intention of recording the nature and the ways of life of a world in formation. A world that maintained the features of something that already existed before the colonizers invaded it, but which also already exhibited radical transformations due to the presence of the colonizers there. A world that incorporated the consequences of colonial violence. In these images, it's possible to visualize in different ways the racist practices that inaugurated and structured Brazil, socially and economically. Images that also served for a long time to naturalize and to normalize that violence. These are images that depict Brazil from the point of view of the colonizer, and that in this way reinforce a relationship of dominance. Images that, when considered together, constitute a striking inventory of the unequal occupation of places by the white and non-white bodies that inhabited Brazil at that time. These are representations that very often promote the dehumanization of indigenous peoples, and that many other times describe enslaved Africans and Afro-descendants as men and women accommodated to a position of subordination. Images that normalize colonial violence as if it was something natural or inevitable. The normalization of the European view of the invaded and colonized regions remained valid, however, well beyond the times represented in these images. In fact, these images underlie the hegemonic and shared memory that even now, 2 centuries after Brazil's political independence from Portugal, one has from that period. When it remembers the colonial Brazil, the immediate image that comes to mind are these images made by the traveling artists in Brazil. A memory that has always been updated through the uncritical reproduction of those images or of images based on them in the most diverse supports and situations. For example, in school history books or in teaching material in general, when these images were reproduced over and over again for more than a century in a very uncritical way. But also in several other cultural products, such as exhibitions, soap operas. And this is a case in point, a soap opera, very famous in Brazilian television that was shown all over the world, called Escrava Isaura, the slave Isaura, in which had, in the opening of every night that this soap opera was broadcasted, one would see over and over again these images of slavery in Brazil. But also advertisement, like this bottle of cachaça, or stamps, or even postcards, and even on clothes, printed on clothes, as it was very natural to exhibit the sense of slavery on the clothes that you wear to go out. But also on hotel rooms, hospital halls, and even illustrating restaurant menus. So it's a naturalization of the scenes of slavery in Brazil over many, many times. So the memory that one has in Brazil from that period was informed over and over again by the reproduction of these images. So this is a memory of colonial Brazil from which many of its brutalities have been erased. A memory of that time that is selective, reproducing only the point of view of the colonizer and their local associates. A memory that supports, therefore, the reproduction and the updating of the processes of domination based on colonial violence, even after the end of colonization as a political order. A memory that integrates what the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano once called cultural coloniality, the result of a process in which European culture shapes the ways of thinking, acting, and remembering of the inhabitants of colonies and former colonies. Even after the end of colonialism as a political order, the colonial way of thinking remains informing the way of remember of that period. But if this memory of what Brazil was has been hegemonic until recently, it began to be openly challenged in more recent years. In fact, given the persistence of cultural coloniality even after the end of political colonization, it is possible to perceive 2 main strategies of counter-hegemonic representation of Brazil's history in contemporary art. Or, if you like, 2 decolonial strategies in Brazilian contemporary art. What I'd like to do then is briefly characterize these two strategies. Strategies that promote in different ways this political turn in Brazilian art that I referred to in the beginning. The first one of these strategies wants to dismantle plantation. And the second one, in turn, wants to get into the pool. These strategies guided two recent curatorial projects I've been involved with, as mentioned by Paul in the introduction. One was Necro-Brasiliana, and the other, Negros na Piscina, Black People in the Pool, which I made in partnership with Fabiana Moraes. I associated the first strategy with the plantation because plantation was the central place, the central institution for the establishment and development of the colonial enterprise in Brazil, still in the 16th century. For the production of commodities like sugar mill, and then cotton and coffee based on slavery work. Plantation was crucial, therefore, for the establishment of this violence that, as I said, has been updated and normalized over the centuries. I take plantation, therefore, as a metaphor for a cultural system of colonization that persists even after the end of the material base that produced it. To dismantle plantation means, in this context, to challenge Brazil's hegemonic colonial memory, only to rebuild this memory from other points of view. It means creating a representation of colonization in Brazil that identifies and exposes damages imposed on millions of the country's inhabitants. It means fighting the coloniality that resists even after the end of colonization as a political regime. To do so, many artists have in recent years taken images made by the so-called traveling European artists as subjects of their investigations. Artists, mainly but not only young indigenous and black artists, who want to make clear that these images tell, what these images tell of the silencing of voices, of open falsifications of history. Artists who want to show how these images tell the history of colonization exclusively through the eyes of the colonizers, who want to show how these images, so insistently reproduced over the years, hide or mitigate serious abuses committed against indigenous peoples and against black men and women enslaved in Brazil. These are artists who challenge a shared, naturalized, and almost comforting visual memory that one has of a Brazil distant in time. These are artists who, even when they do not explicitly assume such an intention, end up decolonizing those representations, unveiling the violent power relations that allowed for those representations to be made. The same power relations that allowed over a long time for an uncritical and even celebratory reception of these images of colonial violence, a violence that, updated, persists in Brazil. I want to show works by three of these artists. The first one, this painting by Tiago Martins de Mello, an artist from North Brazil, from the state of Maranhão, called The Arrival of Ogum and Yansan Post-Account. To make this work, Tiago takes as a starting point the couple formed by a black man and a black woman painted in 1640 on two separate canvases by the Albert Eckhout, a Dutchman artist. Eckhout was a Dutchman artist who spent some years in Brazil during the Dutch occupation of parts of Brazilian territory in the 17th century. These paintings belong to the series of four couples portrayed by Eckhout to supposedly represent the main groups of non-European inhabitants of Brazil at that time. But these schematic figures in Eckhout's paintings are in fact a mixture of information taken from different places in the world, different parts of the world at that time, and not only from Brazil. Actually, they are nondescript representations of the other in the view of the European artists at that time. Moreover, there are no traces of violence on these paintings, of the violence to which black people were permanently subject in the country at that time. And how does Tiago Martins de Mello deal with this image that is as well known as its false, as a representation of people who lived and suffered in colonial Brazil? What he does is to get the man and the woman in fighting attires, in fighting clothes. He arms them with a rifle and a bazooka, and names them, as you learn from the title of the painting, Ogum and Yansan, which are two warrior orishas in Umbanda, one of the Afro-Brazilian religions exist in Brazil. Also, next to the black woman, we also see replacing the child that there was in the original painting by Eckhout as a short white man holding a hammer and a cycle in his hands, which are historical symbols of the communist movement, perhaps suggesting an alliance between those who suffer racial violence and those subjected to class violence, often conflated in Brazil. Racial violence and class violence. An alliance between those to whom have been destined for so long the worst places, the lower places in the unequal distribution of life possibilities in Brazil. The second work I want to show is by artist Jaime Laureano from São Paulo. An installation called Work. The artist assembles over the wall a panel with reproductions of painting, drawings, and engravings in which several artists, but mainly the French artist Jean-Baptiste Debré, portray aspects of life in Brazil in the first decades of the 19th century. Images that are among the most reproduced ones since the time they were made, 2 centuries ago. In these images, it's possible to see how radically different were the occupation designed to white and black bodies at that time, just as how completely different were the hierarchical places occupied by those bodies in the country's social structure. These are images that the artists found reproduced on tapestry, like this one, on calendars, on banknotes, on postcards, on t-shirts, puzzles, porcelains, and even on a wastebasket, all depicting scenes of slave labor. In the midst of the disturbing set of representations, which are stamped on ordinary day-to-day objects like this, soften and naturalize the violence they depict, they portray, the artist inserts small posters of texts with quotes from testimonies of black people who were in different situations mistaken for employees in places they frequented as customers, as if their place was in principle that of subalternity. As one of these posters summarizes, the service entrance is through the back door. On other plaques, the smaller ones, the artist lists some of the occupations filled mostly by black people in Brazil, such as maid, waiter, or street sweeper, which are usually associated with low wages and little social prestige. It's a work, therefore, that attests to the transformation of the open racism, which was the base of slavery, into the more diffuse but equally violent forms of structural racism that permeate social relations in contemporary Brazil. Finally, I want to show a set of works from the series Traumatic Updatings of Debris by Geviana, also from Maranhão, like Tiago Martins de Mello. In these works, Geviana revisits a set of watercolors created by Debré during his stays in Brazil, like this one. That's a piece by Debré made in around 1820s. What she does is to alter, through what she calls digital collages, the ways in which black bodies are represented there, redistributing the position they occupy in those images. If, for example, in this watercolor by Debré, enslaved black men and women stand at the table where their white masters eat, always ready to serve them, Geviana remakes this image by seating these men and women at the chairs. She makes that room theirs room, not only their master's room. In another work, she transforms the scene of the public punishment of enslaved black men into an image of religious and festive celebration. And finally, in another rereading of Debré's work, Geviana changes a representation of forced labor that moves a sugarcane mill, transforming it into this image, an image that shows the production of these huge and colorful flowers and mushrooms. These works are updates of descriptions of colonial violence in Brazil that imagining how different the lives of those black men and women portrayed there in those original images could have been had they not suffered as much as they did. These are works that imagining, amid the memory of pain, healing as an artistic and political project. Made in Brazil in the 21st century, the works of these three artists and several others that I could have also brought here suggests that the representations of Brazil sponsored by European colonizers are recorded evidence of the violence perpetrated against indigenous peoples and the enslaved black population. They suggest that these images, so celebrated for their artistic and historical importance, are also documents of the barbarism that was the construction of Brazil. But not just that. The works of these artists also seem to suggest that the present, that is, the time we all share, must be interrupted by the past, that it must be affected by the past, so that it may be possible to conceive another time which does not exist as yet. A time in future which those killed by colonial violence are defended by us, and in which at the same time the living us are encouraged to fulfill the frustrated or suffocated desires or rights of those who were killed in the past. These are works, therefore, that want to remake the memory that one has of a past Brazil, not only to enter in an open dispute with the dominant ways of remembering the country, but also fundamentally to imagining what Brazil can be from now on. And I find this series by G. Viana particularly interesting because it's a bridge between the two decolonial strategies I mentioned earlier. She wants to dismantle plantation for sure, but she also wants to get into the pool. And what do characterize the second strategy, also developed by many contemporary artists in Brazil? In short, it means a refusal to the reproduction of images of suffering. No more images of suffering, such as those that describe colonial Brazil. It means also the creation in their place, replacing these images of suffering, of images that present those historically subordinated in Brazil in everyday situations of empowerment, of happiness, of beauty. But why to take the swimming pool as a metaphor for this place where violence and suffering are confronted? After all, pools apparently are, as this well-known painting by David Hockney suggests, a painting that is just across the street. Pools apparently are a space of serenity, only broken by the movements and noises that bodies make when they dive into the water, depending, of course, on which bodies enter the pool. Because swimming pools are also historically places of separation and of segregation. Just think about this image. It was made in 1964 and shows the manager of a hotel in Florida, United States, throwing muriatic acid into the water, into the pool, where black and white activists entered to protest exactly against the ban on black people swimming there. And look, this happened just 2 or 3 years before Hockney painting that bucolic swimming pool in the United States. Just think of the reasons why the proportion of the black population that can swim is so much smaller than the proportion of the white population that can swim, simply because the black population has less access historically to swimming pools. And if the pool is this historically prohibited place for black bodies, it's possible to think that entering the pool is a strategy to combat this prohibition. In this sense, the swimming pool metaphorically represents many things that were historically denied to certain segments of the Brazilian population. Wanting to get in the pool means asserting the right for fun and for rest, but not only. Wanting to get into the pool is wanting freedom, equality, autonomy. Wanting to get into the pool is wanting work, food, land, health, housing, safety, love. everything that has always been and still is in the right of the few at the expense of the suffering of the many. Wanting to get into the pool is wanting to be happy. It is no coincidence that the desire to enter into the pool is present as an image in the work of several young contemporary artists in Brazil, most of them black, like this one by Antônio Bar, which recreates the same pool where black people were attacked with acid just for occupying that space. The image you saw before, just to remember. Or this other painting, also by Antônio Bar, which records the moment of that dive, or that fly, the moment of entering the pool. Or this delicate painting by Wallace Pato, in which a boy is about to enter the pool. Or this photograph by Júlio Bittencourt. Or this photograph by Paulo Nazaré, which show us these cards with this phrase written in it, which is negros na piscina, black people in the pool. This title, this phrase, immediately refers to strategies of subversion. It refers to the need for an uprising against interdictions, an uprising against wherever blocks the ways to a fulfilling, gratifying, enjoyable life. An uprising against all that results for centuries of colonization. It's a call for occupation that demands the presence of black bodies in spaces not intended for them in the history of Brazil. A call that you can find, for example, in several paintings by No Martins, in which black men, black women and children have fun in swimming pools or in beaches, in bars, or on the streets. All of these paintings belong to a series called, not by chance, political meetings. Because entering the pool, that is dismantling and having the right to party, demanding and having the right to party and to work, the right to enjoyment and to save it, is a political gesture. Therefore, it's no longer, or not only, a matter of enunciating past damages, of denouncing, in denouncing their present consequences. This is also about demanding and celebrating the right to have a secure and happy life, and having it now. It should be noted, however, that the phrase, black people in the pool, negros na piscina, is inclusive. The noun black, as philosopher Achille Mbembe suggests, does not designate in today's world only people whose skin is darker than those is considered white enough to have access to the existing pools. As Mbembe states, the destitution of humanity from black people by the colonial enterprise also reached other populations, mainly in a world under neoliberal hegemony. There is, as he suggests, a becoming black of the world. Indigenous peoples are, in this sense, black, just like the very poor or transgender people are also black, whether or not they have dark skin. If they have dark skin, they are even blacker. These and other lives were made precarious, and thus were placed in the condition of permanent risk. In this sense, I would like to present a few more works to finalize that point to the strategy of entering the pool as a way to combat the idea, somehow deemed natural or normal over the centuries, that some people, in Brazil, but also in many other places in the world, namely black, indigenous, transgenders, very poor people, immigrants, should be subordinated to white, European, cisgender, rich people. A strategy presented, for example, in this series of photographs by João Bertolini, which shows Esther. Esther was a trans woman who used to live in the streets in São Paulo, and who would be murdered shortly after these photographs were taken. But here, Esther is pictured dancing to Vogue, the well-known Madonna's song. For the artist, remembering Esther, showing Esther in a moment of joy and not in a moment of pain, is to remember that this is possible. That it's possible for that woman to live in joy. Exhibiting and celebrating and remembering Esther dancing to a song she loved is to dispute what can make part of the field of the sensible. Exhibiting Esther dancing Vogue is a political act. I also want to show the work of Val Souza from her Venus series, in which she obsessively photographs herself in the most diverse everyday situations, confronting the racist and misogynistic stereotypes still present everywhere in Brazil. These are photographs that, as a whole, and she made centuries of them, centers of those images of herself. As a whole, they affirm possibilities of being in the world, that were historically denied to black women in Brazil. In these images, Val's body is the announcement of a revolution. It's the announcement that the pool has to be hers too, and now. And finally, I want to show a painting by Jaida Esbel, a contemporary indigenous artist from Brazil. A painting that, like many others he made a few years ago, affirms a culture and understanding of the world silenced for centuries in Brazil. A work that, for its conceptual complexity and stunning beauty, defies any reductive classification. These paintings assert the power of a cosmogony ignored and violated by the European colonizers and by their local followers. A cosmogony that resisted the attacks suffered by Esbel's ancestors. These are paintings that affirm that the power of nature against the limitless exploitation of the resources necessary for life. Nature that, despite all the destruction of the forests, still resists as the only way out to save the world from itself, to save the world from an idea of progress that's self-defeating, an idea of progress that brought us to the profound environmental crisis we are now in, and to the violent death for millions of people. So, when I talk about get into the pool, I'm referring, therefore, to a strategy of building a new symbolical landscape of Brazil. A landscape that doesn't exist yet, but that is being built. An in-progress landscape. A social and affective landscape in which black, indigenous, among many other minorized groups, may have the right to work and the right to rest, and much more. A landscape in which happiness is possible. And remember, although happiness is an abstract concept, it has very concrete expressions for those who seek it. It's a landscape, therefore, that's no longer only marked by pain and damage, but that is also a place of contentment and healing. A landscape formed by the works I've shown here, and by many, many more that have been produced in Brazil over the next years, but also before, like this one showed us. But they were made before, many years ago, but simply were not considered as part of the canonical body of what is contemporary art in Brazil. And now they are finally being rescued and it's shown as part of this enormous body of work that shows that happiness is possible for these people. Happiness is something to be looked at for these people. So these are works that produce sparks of beauty. Beauty as an expression of resistance and as instrument of invention. Thank you.
So can you hear me? Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Moacir. I've actually taken so many notes from your talk, which is an indication for me of how rich and informative and exciting the way that you've characterized the work, and also to see so many artists that I've not seen before. Some of them I've not seen before. It's really exciting to see that kind of work, particularly in the British context, where many of these questions around decolonial strategies, around the representation of black bodies, around thinking through colonial strategies, are very present, including in this university. We have Dr. Matthew Donkor, who's sitting just over there, who does work, and also was in the biennial. What I'd like to do is just maybe start off by asking a couple of questions that I have. I've got many, but I'll try to limit them to a few just to open up a space of conversation. And then, of course, I'd like to invite the audience to speak. So please, when you have a question, if you just stand up or raise your hand, and then someone will bring a mic to you, maybe just say who you are. And I believe that there's also space for people online who have joined us online to send questions through text, which will be fed into me and I can produce that. So, Moacir, thank you very much for that depiction of, as you say, this new landscape that's being built, and the metaphors that you used in terms of characterizing these sort of strategies between the plantation and the pool, which I think is very interesting. But I can also see some problems with those as metaphorical strategies that I'd be interested to see your responses to. And the works are superb, by the way, but I do wonder about the political intentionality and the political effect of some of those strategies. So, for example, the first strategy around dismantling the plantation, and of course the plantation as a metaphor, and to basically fight this logical coloniality, which is really important, and how some of the works that you talked about, the Tiago Martins de Mello, for example, addressed this genre of work by looking at traveling European artists, and then replacing those original figures and perhaps reversing kind of power relations. I guess part of the issue that may come up with that, the problem that came up with that, is it can also work in a binary relation, right? So it's about reversing a historical situation. Not always reversing, but kind of saying, okay, let's replace one set of power relations with another where we center the black body instead of the white colonizer. And I think added to that is the kind of problematic of some of these works. I'm thinking about the works in relation to Debré, where the colonizer is also perhaps unwittingly centered in this work, even though the work is about undoing those relations and reverting those images or replacing those images. It still, in a way, can be seen to center the work of white European colonizers, right? Which I find the pool strategy to be perhaps a bit more generative of centering black images and being constructive. So that was the first point, just to think about the problematic of getting into a binary situation and centering the white gaze or the white figure. In terms of the strategy on the pool, which again I thought was super interesting, and it's interesting that you showed Splash, Hockney's iconic work, which of course represents, I mean, the idea of the pool is often associated, as in Hockney's work, with middle-class aspiration, with a certain kind of sort of aspirational class-based politics. And so I wonder whether the idea of entering the pool, I mean, you talk about it as being a disruptive force of you know, having black bodies there, but it's also a question that it feels as though there's a kind of aspirational quality that, you know, that maybe limits black expression to becoming middle class, you know, to kind of join the party, to be included in that pool. And perhaps what we need to dismantle is the pool itself, perhaps, you know. So thinking about the power relations that exist, that sustain the discrimination, the exclusion of the pool, perhaps just by putting more bodies in the pool doesn't necessarily disrupt that power relation. So those are the two areas. I thought they were really powerful evocations, and again, the works were powerful, but I wondered how you would address those sort of concerns that I have around the way those metaphors are deployed.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your thoughts. I think that first of all, it's important to say that these metaphors and these works, these ideas that I sort of presented here, were developed looking at what these artists were doing. And a few years ago, I realized that many contemporary Brazilian artists, especially black and indigenous artists, were working with these images made by European artists. It seemed to me that they just needed to confront them once and for all. Because these images, all the people from my generation and even younger generations have having seen these images so many times at school, television, everywhere. It's just these images of violence were normalized in Brazil for so many decades, for more than a century, actually. And so it seemed that these artists just needed to confront them. It's not by chance, because that's the new generation of artists in Brazil, that's a generation that was raised in Brazil in a situation in Brazil that they had access to schools, art schools, And because of the social quotas and racial quotas in Brazil over the 2000s and the early 2010s, you have black indigenous peoples in university as you never had before in Brazil. So that's made a huge difference in terms of which question, which subjects, and how these images are dealt with. And so I suddenly realized that there are many artists that were doing so. I didn't make up. So I understand your point that it's sometimes problematic because you still keep the centrality of these images in the arts field, but on the other way around, they just needed to attack them, to challenge them, and to show what the violence that was implied there. So, at the same time, more or less at the same time, but more recently, it's very noticeable in Brazil that other artists are going to a different way. That's the idea of the pool. To stop reproducing these images of suffering, even if confronting them, and creating, generating, imagining other images in which there are no more of suffering images, but situations of suffering, but situations of happiness, situations of well-being, situations in which they could just living in, just being happy, just in having a good life. And I understand also your point about it's not only a question of entering this middle class universe. It's also dismantle all these separations. But when you have
down the master's house.
Yeah. But again, in Brazil, you have this conflation of race and class situation. So entering the pool is also it's not only, it's simultaneously disrupting class and racial segregation. So when you enter the pool, you are challenged the interdictions, not only in racial terms, but also in class terms. You are simultaneously challenged this whole structure, which is very well tied together in Brazil. I don't know if
no, absolutely. I totally I can see absolutely what you're saying, and as you say, I mean, I was really intrigued by this work, because so I went on a now legendary visit to Sao Paulo and Rio and Salvador with Michael Asbury. And we really, Michael, of course, is extremely well known in Brazil, and he took me to many different places. We met many different artists, including a number of black artists, etc. And what I learned from that trip, meeting people like Rosana Paulino and other artists, senior artists, you know, they were very keen to tell me that there was a long history of black artistic production in Brazil, as you mentioned, that had been suppressed, right? But that the most recent decolonial turn, where museums are now saying, "Oh, let's show black artists," you know, is a very, as you say, the last 10 years or so, that's now emerged as it has, you know, around the world, but in Brazil, and but they were very keen to sort of say that there was a whole tradition of work, of many different kinds of work, of complexities of work, often work that focused on traditional Afro-Brazilian culture. And so, for example, the Museum of Afro-Brazilian Art in Sao Paulo was really interesting to visit, to look at all of those various traditions. So my worry about some of the ways in which the more recent work has been characterized is that it can perhaps unwittingly erase that history. that I would like to know more about. I'd like to know more about that. I mean, this work here, for example, I think is really interesting from the 80s. And as you said, was not even recognized as art, but is now being incorporated. So it'd be really interesting to see how the mechanisms of that incorporation, I think through curatorial practice, is one particular way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that recently in Brazil there has been an effort, a collective effort to sort of rescue some artists from the categorizations of primitive artists, art or ethnical art or popular art, which were strategies of putting them aside, of excluding them from the canon of modern and contemporary art. So there have been recent efforts of making exhibitions of artists like Heitor dos Prazeres or Maria Auxiliadora, and other artists were categorized as popular arts. I mean, in the sense of not, they are not doing high art, but they were doing ethnical art or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it's a very interesting time in Brazil because all these productions have been revisited under different lens. And even works by photographers like Afonso Pimenta, who used it to photograph people around his neighborhood, doing these, how to say, domestic photos that were not even considered as having artistic value at that time. So, but now they, also because in Brazil have all these very strong abstract tradition, constructive tradition of concretism, neo-concretism, and the works of artists like Eliot Alicia Clark and others who constituted what until very recently we thought of Brazilian modern and contemporary art. So that eclipsed, it's a very important tradition, of course, but that eclipses put on shadow, under a shadow, all those other artists who were doing something different, who were trying to figure Brazil in different ways, representing Brazil in different ways.
Yeah. Great. So we've got already some questions coming in online, which I perhaps will read out first, and then I'll quickly open up to the audience to please put your hand up. So there is, of course, 2 questions from Michael. First question is, what is the reason why the neighborhood of Ramos referred to in 2 works mentioned?
Sorry?
What is the reason why the neighborhood of Ramos referred to in 2 works mentioned about the pool? I'm not sure what he means by that. Any connection with the photograph by Carlos Vergara? Does that make sense? No. Sorry, Michael, I'm not kidding. I think there may be a mistake there. The other question, Ramos. He mentioned someone called Ramos. Does that sound familiar?
Piscina de Ramos.
Piscina de Ramos.
Yeah, that's a photograph.
He says, why was the neighborhood of Ramos referred to in those works? What was the link with?
The neighbor. Because Piscinão de Ramos. Piscina de Ramos is a piscinão is a large pool. Ramos is a location in the periphery of Rio de Janeiro.
Okay.
That's a public pool that was opened for the people who lived far from the beach. So it's sort of create a large pool for people.
You just detected Cacique de Ramos. There may be a bit of a communication gap there. Another question that he mentioned is, will the falling sky bring the fall of the anthropogite trope in Brazilian art?
Will
the falling sky bring the fall of the anthropogite trope in Brazilian art?
I don't know. Let's see.
It's there.
Okay. That's Michael as well.
That's Michael as well.
Okay. I don't know. I think that he's asking is the end of this tradition of anthropophagy in Brazil, this importance of this anthropophagy trope in Brazil since the 1920s that marks Brazilian modernism.
Tarsila do Amaral and people like that.
Tarsila do Amaral and Oswald de Andrade and all that. Those people. I think that, yes, I think that's, we are living in a time that these very important, these concepts, this idea, these tropes that were very important for a long, long time to interpret Brazilian culture and Brazilian art are being challenged in a, maybe an unstoppable way. In the same way that the presence of Black and indigenous art in Brazilian artist scene is a very new and unstoppable movement as well. In this sense, we experience a very important change in Brazilian art scene.
Sure. So there's a couple more questions coming in, but I think I'll go to the audience to get some questions from the audience first, and then I'll feed back into the questions. Are there any questions from the audience? You want to raise your hand? And then we can, Kimathi.
I'm Moacir. It's been a long time. When I was last in Brazil, which is back in 2010, as part of the Sao Paulo Biennale, which you curated or co-curated, I was part of my sort of, time in Sao Paulo. I spent visiting various artists' homes, institutions, cultural places, and I was struck by what in my eyes appeared to be a very white sort of art world in Sao Paulo. And what you're presenting today suggests that this is transforming. And I just wondered if I were to return to Sao Paulo, would I notice it, or is this still the sort of a very infant kind of movement?
Hi, Kamati. Nice to see you again. Yeah, you have a different experience now, I think, from 13 years ago. I think that it changed a lot in terms of not only the artistic scene, but the galleries, the institutions, the biennial, and also the editorial houses, which of course has, which brings new problems as well. Not to, I don't know if there is this word, tokenize, to make it as a token.
Tokenize, yeah.
Tokenize, the risk of tokenize Black artists, Black writers, which only because they are now a valued commodity for galleries, for institutions, for publishing houses. That's something that artists have to deal with nowadays there. It's a different problem. I don't know if maybe it's a good problem to have now, because although until very recently we don't have this presence of Black artists and Black writers. I think that only the musical scene was something different, has always been something different in Brazil. But visual artists was very, very wide in Brazil until very recently. But just to answer your, yeah, you do have a very different experience now. It's been changing a lot.
Okay, another couple of questions from the text, which I hope I'm reading correctly. So, Thena Silva, Moacir, excellent reflections. You demonstrate another visuality that has been created around the image of the Black Brazilian, above all in the contemporary context. Do you know other productions that have similar proposals in the exaltation and recognition of Black beauty in previous periods?
Yeah, that was talking about, there are these artists like the one I mentioned here, Maria Auxiliadora, E Todos os Prazeres. Fabiana pode me ajudar, maybe help me to remember some artists from from the past that have the same. I know. Oh, Walter Firmo. Walter Firmo was a photographer. All these. No, there are many of them. Many of them that they just are not in the art history books.
Yeah.
They either were considered a photographer, not an artist, or as a folk painter, or ethnical artists. These images have been created all over the time in Brazil.
Yeah.
They were just not seen as art.
Yeah.
They were seen as some anthropological register or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, Arthur Bispo do Rosário, for sure, which was, besides being black, was considered a crazy person, so it was, for a while, wasn't even considered an artist, which of course he is now considered. Mestre Vitalino, and a lot of popular artists who deal with the clay and other poor materials.
Yeah.
Who, because they are poor people, they are not considered artists as well.
Yeah. Michael says Rubin Valentin.
Rubin Valentin as well.
Some names coming
Even
through.
though Rubin Valentin was inscribed in that constructivist tradition in Brazil.
Yeah.
So maybe he was considered.
Yeah.
But as Emmanuel Araújo, also the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
I was thinking about more of people who have been building, imagining,
yeah.
and construct these images, these images of black people, of indigenous peoples living a happy life, not only suffering, not only representations of suffering over like they were represented since the colonial Brazil.
Yeah. There's another question that's come
I think
through.
that.
Sorry, yep, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. It's so interesting to learn more about a subject I don't know very much about. I know a little bit more about the contemporary art market in the UK, and I know questions about the market are not always popular. But these artists are looking at their own history, the visual history of their of Brazil, and I'm wondering how much are they looking outside at the work of black artists from the UK and America. I was thinking of Herman Anderson's work, The Pool achieving like the fourth most expensive painting of a living black artist 2 years ago, or the commission, the Gagosian Gallery and Frieze Masters commission for Tyler Mitchell last year, which was all about this idea of play and leisure and hypervigilance in public spaces. So this idea of play and leisure rather than maybe happiness, so that they're concerned with. Is that something these artists that I'm thinking you probably speak to, are they aware of these kinds of developments, these artists? Are they looking at how they're working and influenced by them maybe?
I think that they are, nowadays it's a very internationalized, globalized circulation, very international circulation of these artists in Brazil, all over the world, of the Brazilian artists all over the world. And I think that they are aware. I don't know if they are, I think that most of them are aware of what's going on in terms of these kind of representations in other parts of the world, even in the UK. I don't know if the problems they face, the questions are the same. I don't think so, although they have some similarities. But the problems, I think that the problem that they face there mainly is the one that I was talking before. It's about how to deal with this very recent overexposure and how to deal with the galleries, the art market, which now see them as commodities. I once was asked by a gallery owner I know if I hadn't, as a curator, if I hadn't a name of a black painter from the northeast of Brazil to present them, to suggest to them. So it's it's a niche in a market, in an oversaturated market. And that's a problem somehow, because it's an attempt at capturing a movement that goes well beyond art market, that has to do with changes in Brazilian society that have been maturing over the last 15 or so years. So it's something, in that way, I think that it is something unstoppable, despite of gallery policies and institution policies.
The question is coming from, I'll come to you in a second. There's a question coming from Adrian Keir. I'm tempted to ask, following François Vergès, about how entering the pool as a strategy might appear, how it might appear from the perspective of those employed to clean the pools. The intersections of race, class, gender, and labor seem key in refounding who gets to see and be seen, not only in the work, but in the world of the work, the art world, perhaps. Perhaps as a comment.
Yeah, that's interesting, because there is, in the exhibition, Negros da Piscina, which I co-author with Fabiana, who is there, there is a movie, a clip of a movie, Que Horas Ela Volta, which time does she come back? It's about a maid who worked in a luxury house, and there was this pool there, and she wasn't allowed to enter in the pool. And the film ends with the pool half emptied, and the house is, there was no one there, only this character is, and she enters, she enters into the pool and takes her phone and calls her daughter and says, "Do you know where I am now? Right now, I'm in the pool." So it's linked to this situation of what's this is class that he's referring there.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. There's one at the back and then one at the front here.
Hi, Moacir. One of the fastest growing galleries in São Paulo is specialized in black artists. Do you feel this is a tokenization, or it's more a positive sign of the market, the art system?
I guess both. I think that's the positives, of course, because the artists have gained exposing. At the same time, as I said before, there is the risk of tokenization because it's a commodity nowadays. So we have to deal with these ambiguous situations. They have to deal somehow with these ambiguous situations. There is no easy way out for that situation, I think. That's capitalism, after all. So we have to deal with these contradictions, and it's a political dispute, as well. It's up to the artists, it's up to the curators and institutions and gallery owners to deal with the situation in their best, or with good faith or bad faith, depending on the case. It's a dispute. It's an open dispute, I think. There's no easy way out.
Okay. There's a question here, and I've also got a question on the text as well.
It was a really beautiful talk and really rich. I was also just thinking about parallels in this country in terms of leisure and well-being, and even the swimming pool itself, where we have a culture where obviously everyone is allowed in the pool, but it's kind of, particularly in outdoor swimming, is very much very dominated by white bodies. And I guess thinking about like Foucault and the idea of care of the self, and as a principle that can be signed up to, but then how that can actually be achieved in terms of social impact. And you know, how we overcome the fact that obviously thinking about the pool as a place for everybody is kind of linked with economics and race and culture, and actually kind of what step it would take for someone to be able to get into the pool in the first place.
Well, politics, I think. What to make to get into the pool. That's what those that were not allowed into the pool are doing for centuries, I think, resisting to this excluding situation. I mean, for the 5 centuries, the descendants of those peoples have been trying to enter in the pool and have been excluded from the pools. And what's happening finally, I think, in Brazil is that the black movements and the indigenous movements that have been working, fighting for decades in Brazil, or in the case of the black movement, more than a century in Brazil, have finally reached a point in which they can demand to be in the pool. They are not being allowed to be in the pool, they demand to be in the pool. And that's, as I said, is an unstoppable movement. It's making politics, is the outcome of political movements over decades in Brazil that are finally reaching a point in which the pool is a possibility. I mean, well-being is a possibility. Just a possibility for now, but even so, is an advance.
Okay, thank you for that. There's another question which also relates to the pool. The pool, I think, is attracting a lot of interest from Fernanda Albertoni. Says, thank you very much for the very informative presentation, Moacir, and for the interesting comments, Paul. Thank you. This is perhaps more of a comment in light of Paul's first question or comment. I thought it would be interesting to stress the depiction of the Piscinão de Ramos in some of the artworks in the pool section, which is a bit of a subversion of a class idea of pool, rather than simply trying to reverse a place of privilege.
Yeah, actually, there was one of those photographs in the beginning of the pool part was in Piscinão de Ramos. And the other one was a painting that in the title had this reference to the Piscinão de Ramos. So I agree with the comment, but it was just to say that it was represented in the images.
So Fernanda has also followed up on the comments here. One last comment. She says, it's also interesting to remember that there are many works being done by black artists in Brazil that connect to other ideas of blackness and water to relate to the idea of the pool. There are more Afrocentric, for instance, exploring the notion of the poetics of Calunga. I wonder if we could think in this sense of a third strategy of black art in Brazil that is decolonial but less colonial stroke white-centric. It would be great to hear your comments about subversion, Moacir.
I don't know, that's more suggestions of a research suggestion of doing. Yeah, there are many other. These are, as I said in the beginning, these are the result. This idea that I presented are the result of 2 different exhibitions I've been created in recent years. Actually, they both happened in the last year in Brazil, one in Recife, other in Fortaleza. And there are only 2 strategies of a very multi-dimensional movement of fighting, of resistance that is happening in visual arts scene in Brazil right now. So these are only 2 strategies. They are not only the only 2 strategies of decolonizing in Brazilian history in contemporary art field, but and others surely exist and could be also brought here in other moments. Thank you for the comment anyway.
Okay, so I think probably, Charlotte, are we wrapping up now? Yep. Okay, well in that case, I'd like to thank Moacir for a brilliant presentation, really informative. You can see from the questions and the comments that came back how much interest there is in this, and something that I know we at Train were very interested to continue that conversation with you, Moacir, while you're here, and when you go back. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you all here and on Zoom for attending the lecture and for listening to this. And sorry for my humble English.
Very good English.
But I'm very happy to be able to share these ideas here with you, and hopefully that will be an ongoing conversation.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks to Charlotte and all the team for putting this event together.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Wonderful, really good conversation. Yeah.
Thank you very much.